Hello, Edumagicians. Welcome to the Edumagic podcast with your host, Dr. Sam Fessich. Dr. Sam is a professor of education, author of Edumagic, and a pumpkin spice latte fan. This podcast is designed for pre-service teachers. Remember, friends, teaching doesn't begin at graduation, but during that first class at 8 a.m. Let's get this party started.
Hi, I'm Batsheva Frankel from Overthrowing Education, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Hello, Edumagicians, and welcome back to another episode of the Edumagic podcast. My name is Dr. Sam Fessich, and today I have with me Phyllis Fagell. She is a counselor, and she's going to be sharing with us some tips and strategies to support our students. So, Phyllis, would you be able to share a little bit about who you are and what brought you into the education field as a counselor?
Yes, sure. And I think from now on, I'm going to have to use the term edumagicians too. I think that's fantastic.
Oh, it's so fun.
It is. And really, that is what teachers in the building where I work are. They definitely are edumagicians. I am in Washington, D.C. I'm in a K through 8 school. I'm the only counselor in the building. It is really pretty amazing to get to watch kids grow up from age 5 all the way through 14 and see that development and see how one phase feeds into the next. I actually didn't start in education at all. I was a journalist initially, ended up going back as a career change to be a counselor. On a lark, did an internship in an elementary school and said, wait a second, what's going on here? Realized I loved it and haven't looked back since.
Oh, wow. I love it. So from journalist to counselor, I love how your story kind of started to feed and grow into the next phase as you went along. So, Phyllis, would you be able to share a little bit about, since this podcast is just for future and new teachers, how we can support students specifically during their middle level years? Now, I know we have some middle school future teachers listening in, and I'm sure whenever they get asked, oh, what grade are you going to teach? And they say middle school, I'm sure they get a reaction, a facial reaction, or a verbal reaction. So what are some ways that our future teachers who are studying to be middle school educators, how can we work and support our students during that really different time in our life as middle schoolers?
I love that question because I think wrapped into that question itself is some of the reasons people fear working with middle schoolers are based on myths and misconceptions about the age. I really love middle schoolers. I think it's speaking of edumagicians, I think it's a pretty magical age for kids because they still very much care what the adults think. They are still really malleable and impressionable. They're making all sorts of mistakes, which actually gives you so many opportunities to really help them grow and become good people. They're starting to care more about their friendships, but they haven't yet gotten to the point where they're fully into that teen phase and far less interested in what the adults in their lives have to share with them. So it's a great opportunity to coach kids. Now, it's very different than elementary school. And when I started elementary, then I went high school, and then I went middle school. So I thought I was going to be just fine because I had done both ends of the pendulum. And as it turns out, I was not prepared at all because middle schoolers are so different. And so the things that I would really emphasize if you're working with kids in this age group, number one, do not personalize anything they say. Nothing. Because in a bid to impress their peers or to not come across as not knowing what they're doing or to even get you, the teacher, to like them, they're going to try to be funny. It's going to fall flat sometimes. They're going to push and test to make sure that you like them. So go into every conversation recognizing that they might be a little bit clumsy in how they interact with you, and don't personalize it. Then I would say the relationship is everything. Start by getting to know them. The difference between relating and teaching is when you're asking them to do something, you're imparting behavioral expectations, you're giving an assignment with different deadlines that you want them to adhere to. Relating is when they're the expert, when they're teaching you something about them. So with middle schoolers, you really want to be taking a couple of minutes at least to talk one-on-one to each kid every week, find out something that's going on in their life, ask them to give you advice, even if it's helping you with something technological, which is what I find myself doing a lot. And then giving them voice and choice, having them contribute to what they're learning, letting them maybe choose the books they're reading sometimes, teach the class. It's so important for them to feel competent, to feel like they have value in that community. And the last thing I would say is to make sure that you're strengths-based. You're going to get much farther with middle schoolers if you leverage their strengths to address whatever those growth edges are, as opposed to really honing in on areas where there are deficits or where they're lagging in some way.
Those were three amazing tips right off the bat. I'm going to go back to one that you had mentioned. You had worked in elementary and high school, and you felt you were ready to go with middle school, but middle schoolers are different. What makes them different?
Part of it is that they're changing faster than kids change at any point in their lives other than from birth to age 2. It's also a phase where they're figuring out their identity. There can be a lot of questioning, whether it's about gender and sexuality, whether it's about where they fit in that peer ecosystem, whether they're good enough. It's suddenly a time when they're acutely aware of how they stack up to others. They might get cut from a team. They might start to be really aware of what you call the imaginary audience, where they feel like everyone is staring at them. Mm-hmm. Right now, my students didn't want to take off their masks when we went mask optional. So many of my middle schoolers, not because they were worried about COVID, but because they actually liked the safety of hiding behind their mask. People couldn't see what they were feeling every minute. Maybe they didn't like the way their face looked, or they had a blemish, or they had been able to conceal their braces this whole time. And really understanding that, yes, they're so insecure, they're so self-conscious, and all of that can make it much harder for them to take risks academically too.
Wow. But that's really interesting that you mentioned about the masks and how some of them didn't want to take it off because feeling that insecurity, and how that can relate to taking risks in the classroom. How can we support our students to try new things? You talked about student choice and voice. How can we help them and support them when it comes to trying out something new in the classroom and taking that risk?
This is where I would borrow from counseling strategies. We know that the best way and the only way to extinguish a phobia is through small exposures, which means you want them to get outside their comfort zone enough that they don't reinforce to themselves that they can't do something, but you don't push them so far or so fast that if it doesn't go well, they're going to want to avoid that risk going forward. So I'll give an example. I had a student who was home much longer studying virtually than classmates because of a vulnerable family member. As a result, she felt like she was very behind in Spanish. And if she was left to her own devices, she would have skipped Spanish altogether, tried to hide out in my office. And so I asked her to rank the risk on a scale of 1 to 10. And it was a 10 going to Spanish. That fear that she might be exposed as incompetent in front of her peers, that would be so embarrassing. It really wasn't a tolerable risk. And so I asked her what a risk might be in that 4 to 7 range, something that pushes her a little bit because it's not an option to opt out altogether. And so what we came up with was that we would spend a set period of time where she knew the teacher wouldn't call on her, but she had to sit in that class. And then the next step would be that the teacher would call on her, but he would preview for her what she would be asked. So she had a chance to prepare in advance. But the understanding all along is that we're working toward full participation, just like her classmates in that setting.
That was a great example. I was hoping you'd share one. And I think that's a fantastic way to help encourage students as we get back into the classroom and encourage them to take those risks and in a calculated, in a supportive way.
With their buy-in. I think that piece of it where you're asking them what a tolerable risk might look like. Another couple of examples, if they're giving a presentation, they might be willing to do that presentation in front of their teacher and a couple of people they trust the first time around. So again, you're just moving the dial. Another example, and this comes up a lot with kids who have 504s or IEPs, often what happens is that the counselor, in conjunction with the support team, comes up with accommodations and strategies. And then they wait a full year before revisiting it. Let's say the kid has test anxiety, and the accommodation is that they're going to take the test in another room because when they're around peers, the rustling of papers, the turning of pages just makes them more anxious. Well, we want to be, from the get-go, writing into that plan what those intermediate steps are. Maybe the next step is that they are taking the test in the classroom with their back to classmates or at a distance away. We don't want to be just establishing that they are opting out and leaving it like that for a full year.
Going back and revisiting those accommodations and modifications, we talk about how an IEP is a legally binding document, but it's not written in stone. It can always go back and be revisited. You need to revisit it every year, but you can go back and make those changes as needed for the student.
Yes.
So Phyllis, let's kind of like switch gears here and talk about SEL strategies and coping mechanisms that teachers need to be aware of during the middle school years. If we think about our middle school students, what are some strategies that we need to be aware of and that we can be using in our classrooms to help support them?
That's a great question, too. And one of the things I would say is that it has to be baked in. If you ask a kindergarten teacher, which I did the other day, we were talking about the SEL strategies our kindergarten teachers were using, and they couldn't think of any because really every single thing they're doing is an SEL strategy. That is what kindergarten really is by definition. And I think there's a lot of parallels to middle school. If you have kids who are experiencing conflict, or if somebody says something in the middle of a lesson that makes somebody else feel uncomfortable or makes somebody else feel psychologically unsafe, you really want to be able to stop what you're doing and address it then and there, because otherwise the learning is going to stop. And in that way, it is very similar to that kindergarten year where kids are learning how to use I statements. We have a peace rug where the kids are taught to resolve problems, literally sitting on the peace rug. And so we want to be helping kids who are vulnerable in a different way than they were back when they were 5, but vulnerable nonetheless, figure out how to resolve conflict, figure out how to address their social needs, how to assume positive intent in their peers. One of the things we know is that kids who don't think other kids are out to get them will have a much gentler middle school experience. So we're looking for ways to normalize that everyone is insecure and struggling. I sometimes will do the iceberg exercise, which if you have the kids write above that waterline what they think the world sees when they look at them, and underneath that waterline, it's, if you really knew me, this is what's going on. And then what I'll do is I'll share what they wrote anonymously in another grade. So if it's a 6th grade, that class that did the activity, I'll read what they wrote in a 5th grade class so that I preserve the anonymity. But the reason I do that is because I want to normalize that everyone is unsure if their friends are their friends. Everybody is worrying about body image or missing out on an invitation or not making a team, and really helping address this idea that people are often making mistakes or saying things that might seem designed to wound, but really are just coming from that social awkwardness, from that insecurity. So the way that looks in the classroom is that we want to be setting them up for success socially. So we want to be pairing them thoughtfully. If somebody doesn't really have friends because they're just a lot for another student, for any one student, rather than constantly pairing them with 1 or 2 of the kindest kids in the class, which will end up actually turning away the 1 or 2 kids who might really be good friend choices for them, maybe spread it out a lot more so they're having briefer interactions, but still having opportunities to practice their social skills, maybe finding ways for them to show gratitude to one another. I like to do, even in middle school, compliment circles where you write the student's name at the top of a page and then they walk around and they give each other an authentic compliment. And you don't know who has written what, but at the end they have this piece of paper with 25 things that their classmates admire about them. And it's such a self-esteem boost for them.
That's a really powerful strategy. I do that with my future teachers at the end of the semester. They all have a paper and they go around and they just write positive vibes, a compliment, a fun memory, something like that. So then they can leave the class with some positive juices flowing. And that's all about supporting them as well.
I love that. And I think sometimes we overemphasize the flip side, making sure that we're calling out meanness, which I think is important too. I like to use class contracts that everyone signs, and the kids come up on their own with the norms for their classroom, the things that they expect and want from one another, and feel responsible for giving to one another, because then you have a language that you can reference and you can say, as a class, we really had agreed that this particular behavior isn't acceptable. So I think it goes both ways. You want to be making sure that you're targeting mean behavior and that people are held accountable for that kind of carelessness with other people's feelings, but also that you're looking for opportunities to really highlight that everyone does want people to feel, their classmates to feel good about themselves.
Right. You had mentioned students who have the mindset of people aren't out to get me, have a more peaceful middle school experience. I think doing activities like the Iceberg activity, that one really spoke to me. I think that's really cool. The compliment circle, the class contract, those are all great strategies that we can implement into our classrooms for sure.
And I think teachers can do so much to help kids self-regulate simply by being authentic, particularly with middle schoolers. At every grade, I think it can be helpful to have maybe a vase or a cup or a jar where you have blank popsicle sticks. And if somebody uses a coping strategy, they can write it on that stick. If it's an older student, they can also write on the other side what the situation was that called for that strategy, because we want students to understand that the same strategy won't necessarily work in every situation, and then put their initials. So that way you have this normalizing of needing to use coping strategies. Teachers can put their own strategies on those popsicle sticks with their own initials. And then if a student needs to try something, they can either try one of their own strategies, try a classmate's strategies, or try their teacher's strategy.
That's awesome. I love that one. I'll have to share more about that in the show notes. That's fantastic. So as future teachers, we're graduating in May, or maybe we're just starting our careers in August. What are some ways we can work with the counselor at our schools to support our students in our classrooms?
The counselor is another resource in the building, much like the school nurse. I work very closely with the school nurse because so often students don't know that their physical symptoms are actually related to their underlying emotions. All the way through K-8, that can be the case. One of the best ways that a student ever explained that whole idea, it was a second grader who said, "My stomach is worrying so much it hurts." Similarly, kids who can appear to have a learning challenge or an attentional challenge, it might be anxiety. So you want to be not going straight necessarily to the learning specialist or straight to the reading specialist, straight to the school nurse, but really pausing and taking stock of that big picture and consulting the counselor. The counselor might have a different perspective. They might have some background on something going on at home that might be helpful for them to share. I do think that one of the tensions that sometimes arises between counselors and teachers is that both teachers and counselors want to serve the needs of the students, but they're not always at liberty to share all of the details related to what's going on in the student's life. So really recognizing that a counselor has the same goal as you and will give you as much information as they can, and will try to find ways to do it so that they don't violate the confidentiality of a family that's requested confidentiality, but so that you can still meet that student's needs. It's not that the counselor doesn't trust that teacher or that the counselor is in some way trying to keep you out of the loop.
That's important to know. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
And Phyllis, you're an author, you're a speaker. Can you share more about your work and how we can get in touch with you? I know you've written a book. My listeners need to know about that. Could you please share more about where we can learn more and connect with you?
Yes, sure. So my book, which has a lot of the strategies that we talked about today, is called Middle School Matters. And it's kind of a what to expect when you're expecting to teach a middle schooler or raise a middle schooler. And I do a lot of writing for newspapers, magazines. Most of those articles can be found on my website, which is phyllisfagell.com. The book can be found anywhere you get books. And then I'm pretty active on Twitter. My feed is @pfagel, and I post a lot of anecdotes about the students I work with, anonymously, of course, and share articles that I think might be helpful to other educators.
Fantastic. I'll make sure I link to your book, your website, and your Twitter handle over on the show notes. Phyllis, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I know my listeners, they might have to rewind and listen to this a couple of times. You shared so many golden nuggets. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And there you have it, Edumagicians. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with your friends. For more Edumagic, check out sfessage.com and follow Dr. Sam on Twitter and Instagram @sfessage. Until next time, you have the Edumagic within you.